Welcome to Dreamscribe, your companion on the journey to peaceful sleep. Before you drift off, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps this calming community grow. Where in the world are you tuning in from? The night was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that pressed against Alex's eardrums like a held breath. The RV was parked at the edge of a secluded rest stop, deep in the pine forests off Highway 41. Crickets had gone silent hours ago. The wind, which had earlier whispered through the trees, had stilled. It was as if the world had decided to pause, leaving Alex stranded in a pocket of absolute quiet. The only sound was the steady drip, drip, drip coming from above. Alex turned over in the small RV bed, still half asleep, mind foggy from exhaustion. They had driven for hours to escape the looming weight of stress, of city life, of everything. Out here, they had hoped to find peace. But peace did not come when something was leaking inside the RV. They groaned, rubbing their eyes before fumbling for their phone, tapping on the screen. 2:37 a.m. Drip. Annoyance outweighed exhaustion, and Alex sat up, listening carefully. The sound wasn't coming from the sink, nor from the bathroom. No, it was coming from above. They tilted their head back and squinted at the ceiling. In the dim glow of the emergency light, they could just make out a small, dark stain directly overhead. Water damage? That was impossible. The RV roof had been checked before this trip. No leaks, no cracks. And yet, drip. The sound of liquid hitting the mattress. Alex's stomach twisted. They slowly reached out, running their fingers over the spot where the droplet had landed. Cold. Freezing, actually. With a growing sense of unease, they turned on the main cabin light, flooding the RV with a weak, yellowish glow. And that's when they saw it. The dark stain wasn't just a stain. It was a handprint. A single, wet handprint splayed across the ceiling, the fingers elongated, reaching. The shape was impossibly large, too high for anyone to have placed there. Alex's breath hitched. Their minds scrambled for a logical explanation. Condensation? Mold? Some bizarre weather effect. But logic crumbled in the face of one undeniable fact. It looked fresh. Drip. Another drop fell, landing against Alex's wrist. The touch sent a shiver straight to the bone. They jolted out of bed, heart hammering, their pulse roaring in their ears. 1,000 thoughts collided in their mind. Who had been in the RV? How did this get here? Could someone be on the roof? They grabbed their flashlight and, with shaky hands, unlocked the door, stepping into the cold night. The forest loomed around them, shadows stretching and distorting under the weak glow of the RV's exterior lights. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, leaving everything drenched in an eerie darkness. Steeling themselves, Alex turned the beam of their flashlight upward. Nothing. The roof was completely clean, no damp spots, no leaks, no signs of anything unusual. They exhaled sharply, rubbing their temples. Maybe they were imagining things. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on them. Swallowing back their nerves, they climbed back inside and locked the door, willing themselves to dismiss what they saw. Still, their hands trembled as they wiped the handprint away with a towel. The dampness clung stubbornly, and for a second, it almost felt as if something unseen resisted. Finally, they switched off the lights and crawled back into bed. The RV creaked as it settled. Silence returned, wrapping around Alex like a too-tight blanket. Then, just as they began to drift back into uneasy sleep, Alex's eyes snapped open. Their breath caught in their throat, dread seeping through their veins like ice water. Slowly, ever so slowly, they turned their head toward the ceiling. The handprint was back, but this time there were more. 5, 10, 20. A cluster of wet handprints, all varying in size, sprawled across the ceiling like desperate, grasping fingers. And then, the RV rocked. A single, slow movement, as if something had just shifted its weight on the roof. Alex couldn't breathe. They couldn't move. A thick, suffocating terror wrapped around their chest, pinning them in place. Then, through the silence, came a whisper from above, barely audible. "Let me in." The ceiling groaned, the wood creaking, bending, as if something was pressing downward. Alex bolted upright, scrambling for their keys, for anything, but before they could move, a single, wet drop landed on their forehead. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let me in." And the light flickered out. The RV was nothing special, at least not at first glance. A used but well-kept Class C motorhome. Its beige and brown stripes had begun to fade under years of sun exposure. Adam and Lisa had bought it 6 months ago, trading in city life for a nomadic existence on the open road. The freedom, the endless stretches of highways, and the quiet of remote campsites had seemed like the perfect escape. Their days were predictable, waking up with the sunrise, brewing coffee on their small propane stove, and plotting their next destination. Lisa, a freelance writer, spent her mornings typing away on her laptop, while Adam, a photographer, roamed the nearby landscapes capturing the beauty of their surroundings. At night, they huddled by the fire, shared stories, and marveled at the vast sky above, free from the glare of city lights. The RV was cozy. The sleeping area above the driver's cabin was cramped but comfortable. The small kitchenette and dining table were just enough for their needs. They had grown accustomed to the occasional creaks and groans of the vehicle settling as temperatures changed. It was part of the charm. Every vehicle had its quirks, and theirs was no different. The handprints were not there at first. Their nights, though solitary, had been peaceful. They often parked in secluded spots, quiet forests, scenic overlooks, or hidden clearings. They rarely encountered trouble beyond the usual annoyances of road life: flat tires, unpredictable weather, or the occasional unfriendly passerby. Safety was always a priority, but they had never felt threatened, until the first handprint appeared. One morning, Lisa woke up first, stretching before groggily making her way to the kitchenette. The smell of dampness was the first thing she noticed, a strange, earthy scent that hadn't been there before. As she reached for a coffee mug, her eyes drifted upward and she froze. Above the table, near the center of the ceiling, was a single wet handprint. At first, she laughed it off, thinking it was a stain from condensation, but when she touched it, her fingers came away damp. The print was too clear, too deliberate. The shape was undeniably human. She called Adam over, who frowned as he studied it. "Maybe it's from the rain," he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. They wiped it away and moved on with their day. But the next morning, there were 3. Each day, the number increased. Some were small, childlike. Others were larger. They appeared in different areas of the ceiling, sometimes clustered together, other times spaced apart as if something, or someone, had been crawling above them during the night. They checked for leaks. Nothing. They cleaned the ceiling thoroughly, but the handprints always returned. And each morning, they were fresh, glistening as if they had just been made. At first, they rationalized it. Maybe it was something harmless, an effect of condensation or a trick of their minds. But deep down, unease began to creep into their daily routine. Lisa found herself glancing up more often, expecting to see the prints forming before her eyes. Adam started keeping a flashlight next to the bed, waking up at odd hours to shine it at the ceiling. The RV, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, one where something unseen left its mark while they slept. The final sign that something was wrong came when Lisa decided to record the night. She set up her phone, angling it toward the ceiling before they went to bed. What they saw the next morning changed everything. Mark's dreams were restless, filled with whispers and distant echoes of laughter. The sensation of damp air clung to him as he tossed and turned in his sleep. It wasn't until a sharp sound, like wet slaps against the ceiling, jerked him awake that he knew something was terribly wrong. His pulse thundered in his ears. The RV was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds. He reached for his phone, its screen flashing 3:17 a.m. He turned onto his back and stared at the ceiling. The handprints were back, but this time they weren't faint. They were bold, dark, fresh. The outline of fingers and palms, larger than before. More of them. Mark's breath hitched as he forced himself to sit up, his body cold with dread. He turned on the overhead light, illuminating the interior of the RV in a warm yellow glow. The prints should have faded instantly, just like the first time. But they didn't. They remained wet and glistening. Then they began to move. He gasped, scrambling out of bed as the prints stretched and shifted, as if unseen hands were pressing into the ceiling at that very moment. His chest tightened. He backed away, his legs colliding with the small kitchenette counter. The RV felt impossibly small, the walls closing in on him. A sharp knock at the door made him flinch. His heart pounded. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? He hesitated before forcing himself forward. His fingers hovered over the door handle. He swallowed his fear and yanked it open. No one was there. The night outside was eerily still. The wind barely stirred, the trees unmoving. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with moisture. A sense of being watched crept up his spine. He turned back inside, locking the door behind him. The handprints were gone. The ceiling was clean, as if nothing had ever happened. Mark stood there, heart hammering. He knew now, this wasn't just some weird moisture effect or condensation. Something was in the RV with him. The discovery of the wet handprints on the RV ceiling had already set Blake on edge. They appeared every morning without fail, regardless of where he parked or how meticulously he cleaned the ceiling before bed. But now things had escalated. The handprints were growing in number. What had started as a single print above his bed had now spread across the entire ceiling, stretching toward the driver's seat. Worse yet, they were no longer just stains. The last time he reached up to touch them, he swore he felt residual moisture, as if someone had pressed their damp palms against the roof only moments before. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the RV sent shivers down Blake's spine. He had tried everything, scrubbing, repainting, even sticking paper over the spots, but nothing stopped them from returning. They were always fresh, always wet, and always expanding. That was when he decided to run. Blake thought if he could put enough distance between himself and whatever was haunting his vehicle, maybe it would stop. He packed up everything in a frantic rush, tossed his supplies into the cabinets, and pulled out onto the open road without a set destination. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. For the first few hours, the drive felt liberating. He kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting something, anything, to happen. But the highway stretched on, empty and silent. The paranoia began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt. By midnight, he found himself in a desolate truck stop, miles from civilization. He turned off the engine, exhaled in relief, and reclined in the driver's seat, convinced that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was over. But then he heard it. A faint, wet drip. His breath hitched as he flicked on the overhead lights. The ceiling was soaked. The handprints were everywhere, darker and more pronounced than ever before, and the water dripped from them steadily. As if someone was crawling on the roof, pressing their hands down so hard the moisture seeped through. He screamed and peeled out of the truck stop without even turning off the lights. Distance wasn't the answer. If he couldn't outrun it, maybe he could force it out. Blake drove until sunrise, stopping only when exhaustion became unbearable. He parked at a campground and threw himself into researching paranormal phenomena. Every website, forum, and obscure book he found pointed to a singular solution: cleansing the space. Armed with a mixture of salt, sage, and holy water purchased from a skeptical but willing priest in a nearby town, Blake set to work. He sprinkled salt in every corner, chanted prayers he barely understood, and burned sage until the RV smelled like a forest fire. Finally, he took a bottle of holy water and flicked it onto the ceiling. For the first time in days, nothing happened. Blake laughed, a raw, relieved sound. He collapsed onto the bed, inhaling deeply. Maybe, just maybe, he had won. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., a sound reverberated through the RV. A wet slap, like a hand hitting a wall. His stomach clenched. Another slap, this time louder. Then another. He didn't want to look up, but his eyes betrayed him. The ceiling was writhing. Dozens of handprints were appearing in real time, as if invisible hands were pressing down with force. They weren't just stains anymore. They were moving, shifting, crawling toward him. The entire RV groaned under the unseen weight. Blake bolted for the driver's seat, turned the key, and slammed on the gas. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay. Panic had settled deep in his bones by the time he reached the outskirts of an abandoned service station. The handprints weren't just in the RV anymore. His arms were damp. His clothes clung to him as if drenched. When he checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, he saw them, faint, wet outlines of fingers pressing against his own skin. That was it. He had to end this. Shaking, Blake grabbed the emergency gas can from the storage compartment. He doused the inside of the RV in gasoline, watching the liquid seep into the fabric and wood. His fingers trembled as he struck a match. The moment the flame flickered to life, the RV screamed. Not the sound of fire catching, something else. A wailing, agonized shriek reverberated from the walls, shaking the entire vehicle. The handprints darkened, turned from damp stains to something more solid. They pulsed, twisted, and then Blake dropped the match. The explosion sent him flying backward, landing hard on the cracked pavement. Flames roared, consuming the RV in seconds. Smoke billowed into the night sky as the shrieking faded into a whisper. And then silence. Blake lay there, breathing heavily, watching the RV burn to nothing. For the first time in weeks, no handprints appeared. The nightmare was over. Or so he thought. As he pushed himself up, dazed but alive, his vision blurred. His head throbbed. He stumbled toward the road, desperate to get away from the inferno. Then he felt it, a wet drip against his shoulder. His blood ran cold. Slowly, unwillingly, he turned his gaze upward. High above him, where the smoke curled into the sky, dozens of wet handprints were forming on the blackened clouds, and they were reaching down toward him. As the unsettling handprints continued to appear on the ceiling, the protagonist, riddled with fear and frustration, knew they had to find answers. The RV felt less like a home and more like a trap. The first step was to research if there had been previous incidents of hauntings or unexplained occurrences in the area. Searching online, they found scattered forum posts about travelers who had experienced eerie phenomena along the same stretch of highway, but nothing specific about ceiling handprints. Desperate, they reached out to local historians and paranormal experts. One investigator, a woman named Evelyn who had studied supernatural cases, responded with curiosity and concern. She arranged to meet at a nearby diner to discuss the case further. Over a cup of coffee, Evelyn explained that handprints were a common manifestation of residual hauntings, spirits trying to communicate or leave behind traces of their past. But these prints were different. Wet handprints usually indicate something trying to emerge, she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn suggested conducting an overnight investigation in the RV, using specialized equipment like infrared cameras and EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recorders. That night, they sat inside the RV, tension thick in the air. The cameras picked up strange distortions near the ceiling, and faint whispers were caught on the recorder. The words were difficult to make out, but the name Daniel surfaced repeatedly. Digging deeper into local records, they uncovered a chilling discovery. A missing boy named Daniel who had vanished decades ago. Witnesses had last seen him near an old, abandoned rest stop, one that happened to be along the protagonist's recent travel route. Fueled by dread and curiosity, they drove to the dilapidated stop and combed through the area. There, in the ruins of an old building, they found a crumbling journal. The pages hinted at a tragic story, a child hiding in fear, leaving desperate messages scratched into the walls before vanishing forever. Returning to the RV, the protagonist now understood that the entity behind the handprints wasn't just a random spirit. It was Daniel, reaching out from beyond. But why? What did he want? And more importantly, what would happen if he finally emerged? The storm had rolled in quickly, blanketing the sky in thick, suffocating darkness. The RV rocked against the howling wind, the rain pelting the windows in chaotic rhythms. Inside, Mark sat rigidly in the dim glow of a single lantern, gripping a metal flashlight so tightly his knuckles ached. He had prepared for this. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but tonight there was nowhere to go. Tonight, he would face whatever had been leaving the dripping handprints on his ceiling. The events of the past nights had worn him thin. It wasn't just the handprints anymore. It was the creeping paranoia, the subtle movement at the edge of his vision, the barely perceptible whispers when the wind was silent. He had taken precautions, sealing the doors, closing every vent, scrubbing away the prints with bleach before they could grow worse. But deep inside, he knew none of it mattered. Something was inside the RV with him. Something that didn't care about locked doors. 11:57 p.m. Mark's breathing was slow, controlled. His phone was recording, propped against the kitchenette counter, set to night vision. If the handprints appeared again, if anything moved in this place, he would finally have proof. Lightning flashed, illuminating the inside of the RV for an instant. The shadows contorted unnaturally in the brief burst of light, twisting, shifting, something wrong. Then darkness again. A soft creak came from above. The ceiling. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. His gaze lifted, throat going dry. The wooden paneling above him was untouched. No movement. No marks. But something felt wrong. The air was heavier, thick with a damp, moldy scent that hadn't been there before. Then, a single drop of water landed on his forehead. He wiped it away, his fingers trembling. Another drop. Then another. With a sinking feeling, he lifted the flashlight and aimed it at the ceiling. The wet stains had already formed. Not just a few this time, dozens. They stretched across the entire ceiling, overlapping, some small like a child's, others grotesquely large, fingers unnaturally long. The water dripped steadily from them now, trickling down the walls, the cabinets, forming pools on the floor. Mark barely suppressed a gasp. He hadn't heard them appear. Usually, the prints formed slowly, one by one. But tonight, they were simply there. All at once. Then he saw it. One set of handprints moved. The wet stain shifted unnaturally, twitching like it was alive, crawling along the ceiling panels. Mark scrambled backward, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Then another print moved. Then another. The sound came next, faint scratching. A horrible, fingernail against wood scrape that set his teeth on edge. It was coming from above, from inside the ceiling. Mark's pulse thundered as he grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife. His flashlight flickered, the shadows stretching impossibly long in the confined space. The sound above grew louder, like something shifting, dragging itself. A sudden thud from above made Mark yelp. The light bulb above him exploded in a shower of sparks. The RV was plunged into darkness. Then, in the pitch-black silence, he heard breathing. Slow, wet, just above his head. Mark didn't think. He lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock, twisting the handle with slippery fingers. His breath came in ragged gasps as he threw himself out into the storm. The rain hit him like ice, soaking through his clothes instantly. He spun back to the RV, expecting to see something pressing against the window, something crawling out of the ceiling panels. But the windows were dark, the handprints were gone, and the door behind him was still closed. Drenched and shivering, Mark backed away slowly, his heart hammering. The RV sat silent and still, untouched by the nightmare he had just endured inside. It looked normal, too normal. Something made him glance at his phone. It was still recording. His blood turned to ice. The video showed him sitting stiffly at the table, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. The handprints were on the ceiling, but he wasn't reacting to them. Then he saw himself stand up, but the real him hadn't moved. The thing that wore his face smiled. And then it started crawling up the wall. The video ended abruptly. Mark's breath came in sharp gasps, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. The thing in the RV, it wasn't him. It had been inside with him for days. Watching, mimicking. And tonight, it had finally shown itself. For a split second, Mark saw a figure standing inside the RV. It was looking directly at him, and it had no face. 7. The resolution and twist. A hollow reflection. Mark's chest heaved as he stumbled backward in the rain, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His breath came in short gasps, mixing with the cold night air. Inside the RV, the figure still stood. It wasn't moving. It wasn't human. It was him. Mark's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs locked in place, frozen by the impossibility of what he was seeing. The figure inside wore his clothes, had his hair, his posture, yet it was wrong. Its face was blank. A smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin stretched over where its eyes, nose, and mouth should be. Yet Mark could feel its gaze, a heavy, unnatural weight pressing into him, studying him. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It reached up, pressing both of its hands against the inside of the RV's window. Wet, smudged handprints bloomed beneath its fingers. Mark's stomach lurched. All this time, the handprints hadn't been appearing. They had been pressing through from the other side. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the thing in stark, unnatural clarity. It tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, Mark swore he saw the outline of a grin stretching beneath the blank flesh. The RV door creaked open. Mark bolted. His feet pounded against the muddy ground as he sprinted toward the tree line, breath ragged, lungs burning. The storm raged around him, wind howling like a living thing. His mind screamed for him to stop, to turn back, but he didn't dare. Something wasn't right. The trees stretched on forever. No matter how far he ran, his RV remained within sight. It loomed in the darkness, untouched by distance, sitting in the exact same place. The door still slightly ajar. The figure still standing inside. Mark whirled around, disoriented. He should be deep into the forest by now. But he wasn't. He was trapped. Then a voice behind him. Not the wind. Not the storm. A whisper. Close. You left the door open. Mark spun, swinging his flashlight wildly. Nothing. But the whisper had been right at his ear. A terrifying realization. His pulse pounded as he turned back toward the RV. The figure was gone. The door was open wider now. The inside was dark. Silent. A slow, horrible understanding settled into Mark's bones. The thing hadn't wanted him to run. It wanted him to come back. It was luring him. Mark clenched his fists, forcing himself to think. If he left the RV here, if he ran and never came back, would it still follow him? Or worse, would he lose something of himself if he didn't reclaim it? What if the thing inside wasn't just a copy of him? What if it was taking his place? No sounds inside the walls. Had it left? Mark turned, scanning every inch of the small space. The bed, the kitchenette, the tiny bathroom. all untouched. He reached for his phone, desperate to check the recording from earlier. But the phone was gone. A sharp prickle ran down his spine. A new sound. Breathing. But it wasn't his. The final confrontation. Mark whirled around, and his stomach twisted into a knot of pure, unfiltered horror. He was staring at himself. His exact reflection. Clothes soaked, hair dripping, chest rising and falling in perfect sync. But his eyes were missing. Just two empty, black voids gaping back at him. And then it smiled. A slow, curling grin that spread too far, stretching across its face, revealing teeth that weren't human. Mark stumbled back, his hands flying to the door handle. But it wouldn't budge. The thing stepped forward. "You're in my place," it whispered, tilting its head unnaturally. "You left the door open." Mark's vision swam as reality buckled around him. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, the floor beneath his feet shifting like liquid. The thing reached out. Its fingers touched his forehead. And everything. Mark gasped. He was standing in the middle of the RV. The storm was gone. The handprints were gone. Everything was eerily still. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? Then he saw himself, sitting in the driver's seat. His own body. Perfect. Normal. Alive. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to step forward, but he couldn't. His limbs refused to obey. His head tilted on its own. His arms lifted without his command. Then he saw the wetness on the ceiling above him. Handprints. His handprints. The thing in the driver's seat turned, meeting his gaze. It smiled. And then, it started the engine. Mark screamed, but no sound came out. Because Mark wasn't Mark anymore. He was inside the ceiling. A trapped, silent, watching reflection. And as the RV rumbled to life and drove off into the night, the wet handprints began appearing once again. The next story. The Tulane Highway stretched endlessly into the horizon, a cracked, faded ribbon of asphalt cutting through the barren desert. The sun had dipped below the jagged mountains an hour ago, leaving only a dim, purple afterglow on the skyline. The RV's headlights were the only illumination in the growing darkness, twin beams stabbing into the void ahead. Inside the vehicle, Mark adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, stifling a yawn. He had been driving for hours, lulled into a trance by the monotonous hum of tires against the road. The nearest town was over 60 miles behind him, and the next gas station, if his map was accurate, was at least another 100 ahead. That was fine. He was used to solitude. He liked it, in fact. The open road, the silence, the freedom. It was why he had bought the RV in the first place. No neighbors, no noisy city streets, just him and the road. Still, something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind had suddenly stopped, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. Maybe it was the way the road seemed to stretch longer than usual, as if he were driving in place. Or maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. Then a sound. Faint, barely noticeable over the engine's steady rumble. Mark furrowed his brow and instinctively turned the radio down, leaving the cabin in complete silence. There it was again. A rhythmic crunching. Footsteps. Mark's fingers tensed on the steering wheel. No way. He was moving at 50 miles an hour. There was nothing but empty road and desert around him. There was no one out there. Still, the sound persisted. A slow, measured tread, pacing alongside the RV. Not running, not staggering. Walking, like someone was casually keeping up with him, step for step. His breath caught in his throat as he stole a glance at the side mirrors. Nothing but the cold glare of the taillights stretching into blackness. Maybe it was something loose, something rattling in the chassis? He pressed the brakes slightly. The RV slowed. The footsteps slowed too. Mark's pulse quickened. He tapped the gas, accelerating again. The sound matched his speed. That's impossible. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He flicked on the cabin lights, then leaned forward, peering into the side mirror again. He tightened his grip on the wheel. His heart was now hammering against his ribs. The rational part of his brain fought against the growing dread. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a sound from inside the RV, bouncing in a weird way. Yeah, that had to be it. Taking a deep breath, Mark reached for the passenger side window controls. He hesitated. A small voice in his head screamed not to do it. But he ignored it and pressed the button. The glass rolled down. A rush of cold desert air flooded in. For a moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, crunch, crunch, crunch. Clearer, closer, right outside the RV. The first glimpse of fear. Mark slammed the window shut. The footsteps didn't stop. He forced himself to look into the side mirror one last time, and his stomach turned ice cold. In the red glow of his taillights, the dust on the road was shifting, not drifting with the wind, not disturbed by his tires. Something unseen was walking in it. Mark felt his entire body go rigid. A perfectly circular path of footprints was forming around the RV, one slow step at a time. Yet, there was no one there. Just the empty night. Just the silence. Just crunch. A new footprint appeared, directly outside his driver's side door. Mark's foot slammed onto the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, tires skidding against the road as he tore through the night. The footsteps? They didn't fall behind. They kept up. Mark's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He flicked his high beams on, scanning the roadside in desperation, looking for anything. A building, a gas station, another car. Nothing. The darkness pressed in. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He had to get away. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. And then, the radio crackled. A burst of white noise, cutting through the tense silence. Mark jumped, nearly swerving the RV off the road. He shot a glance at the stereo. He hadn't turned it on. And yet, through the static, a voice emerged. Not a clear one. Not a normal one. A whisper. Dry, brittle, like dead leaves crumbling underfoot. A voice that sent a cold spike of terror through his veins. Stop running. Mark's vision blurred for a second, his mind scrambling for an explanation. No. No, no, no. He didn't even realize he was whispering no under his breath over and over, as if saying it enough times would break whatever nightmare he had fallen into. But the voice didn't care. The radio hissed again, and this time, the whisper carried something far worse. You've already stopped. Mark's breath hitched. His hands flew to the wheel, yanking it left and right, feeling the resistance of the road, the movement of the tires. But something was wrong. The RV wasn't moving. Not forward. Not backward. Not at all. It was stuck, like time itself had frozen. His foot was still pressed hard against the gas pedal. The speedometer still showed 65 miles per hour, but outside the window, the desert wasn't moving. The world was standing still. And then, for the first time, Mark realized something even worse. The footsteps had stopped too, because whatever was making them was now inside the RV. Sunlight streamed through the RV's windshield, a stark contrast to the chilling events of the previous night. The golden hues of the desert morning cast long shadows over the road ahead. The nightmarish memory of the footsteps, the eerie radio transmission, and the frozen world still clung to Mark's mind, but in daylight it felt distant, like a bad dream that refused to fade completely. Maybe it was just a dream. Maybe exhaustion and solitude had finally caught up with him. And yet, Mark's grip on the steering wheel was too tight. His knuckles were white. His heart still thundered in his chest at the mere thought of what had happened. But now, in the morning light, with the highway stretching endlessly ahead and nothing but the occasional gust of wind against the RV, everything seemed normal. He took a slow breath and forced himself to focus on reality. The fuel gauge read just above half. Good. No need to stop for another 100 miles. The radio was silent. No static. No whispers. The engine hummed smoothly beneath his feet. The rearview mirror reflected nothing but an empty road. If something had followed him last night, it was gone now. Maybe it had never been there at all. Mark leaned back in his seat, stretching one hand before adjusting the volume knob on the radio. Music. That would help. The static was gone now. Whatever had happened last night, it wasn't happening now. A song crackled to life. Some old country tune, soft and lazy, filling the small space of the RV. It felt good, normal, like the world was back to the way it should be. He reached for his coffee cup, now lukewarm and bitter, but he sipped it anyway, letting the caffeine sharpen his senses. His eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. 9:13 a.m. Still early. Plenty of time to cover distance before he'd need to stop for gas. Mark took another sip of coffee, then glanced at his phone, checking for service. No signal. Not surprising. He was still deep in the desert, far from any town or cell tower. He had grown used to isolation on these long road trips. The silence, the lack of people, it was peaceful. Usually. He tried to push the unease from his mind. There was nothing strange about last night. Nothing at all. Except, something nagged at him. Mark reached for the side mirror controls and adjusted the angle. His eyes scanned the dirt road behind him, half expecting to see. No. Stop it. It had been his imagination. But the nagging feeling didn't go away. He thought back to the dust on the road, shifting in perfect circles. The crunching footsteps keeping pace with the RV. The whisper through the radio. "You've already stopped." His stomach twisted at the memory, but there was nothing out there now. Just empty desert, the same as always. But then, as he turned his gaze toward the ceiling of the RV, a chill ran down his spine. The thin layer of dust from the night before, it had been disturbed, right in the center of the ceiling. Small patches were wiped clean, like someone had brushed against it, or pressed their hands against it. Mark swallowed, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He hadn't touched the ceiling. He would have noticed. He forced himself to shake his head. It was nothing. Had to be. A trick of the light. A weird shift in the RV's movement during the night. Nothing more. Still, he made a mental note to clean it later. Out of sight, out of mind. By midday, the desert sun was unrelenting. Waves of heat shimmered across the asphalt, distorting the horizon. The air was thick and dry, pressing against the RV like an invisible weight. Mark spotted a tiny gas station up ahead, a lone outpost in the middle of nowhere. A rusted "last stop for 150 miles" sign stood just outside, leaning slightly as if it had been forgotten. He pulled into the lot, parking beside the only other vehicle in sight, a dusty, old pickup truck with no plates. The gas station looked half abandoned, but the lights were on inside. Mark grabbed his wallet and stepped out of the RV, squinting against the harsh glare of the sun. The place smelled like hot asphalt and gasoline. A small bell chimed as he pushed open the door. Inside, a single old man sat behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper that looked 10 years old. Mark cleared his throat. "Pump 3. The old man barely glanced up. "Cash or card?" "Card." The man grunted, punched something into the register, then slid the card reader across the counter. Mark swiped his card. As the transaction processed, he hesitated. The events of last night burned in his mind, but they felt ridiculous now, standing here in a gas station under the midday sun. "Still, you ever hear anything weird out here?" Mark asked. The old man didn't look up. Didn't even pause. "What kind of weird?" Mark wasn't sure how to answer. He debated mentioning the footsteps, the radio, the feeling of something watching him. But instead, he simply said, "Anything strange at night?" The old man turned a page in his newspaper. Didn't even blink. Then, in a voice that sent a chill down Mark's spine, he muttered, "You heard him, didn't you?" Mark felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" The old man finally looked up. His cloudy gray eyes locked onto Mark's. "You wouldn't be asking if you hadn't heard him." Mark's throat went dry. "The footsteps?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The old man didn't smile. Didn't blink. Didn't deny it. "They don't like you noticing," he muttered, voice low and distant, as if he were remembering something he didn't want to. Mark's pulse quickened. Who doesn't like being noticed?" The old man exhaled slowly. Then he leaned forward, voice barely audible. "You need to leave before dark." Mark's skin crawled. A dozen questions swirled in his head, but before he could ask any of them, the old man suddenly slammed the register shut. "Pump's ready," he said, tone flat. "Drive safe." Mark hesitated, heart pounding. For a brief second, he considered pressing for more information. But something about the way the old man wasn't looking at him anymore, the way his fingers gripped the counter just a little too tightly, made him turn and leave. As he stepped back into the sunlight, the heat felt suffocating. He filled the tank faster than usual. Then, without another glance back, Mark climbed into the RV and pulled onto the road. The gas station faded into the distance. Mark exhaled, gripping the wheel. "It's nothing. Just a crazy old man. Just exhaustion. Just his mind playing tricks." And yet, as the desert stretched endlessly before him, Mark's gut twisted. Because something about the silence felt wrong. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, he realized something even worse. The footsteps hadn't come back last night, but that didn't mean they were gone. They were just waiting for nightfall. And this time, they wouldn't stop at just circling the RV. The sun dipped toward the horizon, turning the desert sky into a violent smear of red and orange. Mark checked the clock on the RV's dashboard, 6:47 p.m. He had been driving for hours since leaving that tiny, unsettling gas station. The old man's warning still echoed in his head. "You need to leave before dark." It had been vague, cryptic, and worst of all, it had felt real. Mark had planned to push through the night, get as many miles between himself and that place as possible. But the exhaustion was creeping in, making his eyelids heavy. His hands ached from gripping the wheel for so long. He couldn't drive much further. Up ahead, a small desert rest stop came into view. Nothing more than an empty parking lot, a few faded picnic tables, and a single streetlight flickering weakly in the approaching dusk. Mark pulled the RV into the lot, parking near the edge. No other cars, no buildings, just miles of barren land in every direction. It was quiet, too quiet, but Mark ignored the unease crawling up his spine. I just need a few hours of sleep. Then I'll keep moving. As the engine shut off, a deep silence settled over everything. No crickets, no wind, just emptiness. Mark locked the doors, checked the side mirrors, then climbed into the back of the RV. He closed the curtains, crawled into bed, told himself that nothing was out there, told himself that he was alone. And then, the footsteps started. At first, Mark thought it was the wind, a faint crunching noise outside, light, almost distant. But then it grew louder, closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone or something was walking around the RV. Mark's pulse spiked. He lay frozen, staring at the dark ceiling, barely breathing. The sound moved with an unnatural rhythm. Too slow, too deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted him to hear it. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. The pacing sent a deep, primal fear through Mark's chest. He forced himself to sit up slowly, his body trembling. He reached for his phone, still no signal. The footsteps circled the RV again. Mark swallowed hard, muscles locked in place. Look outside. See who's there. But some deep, instinctual part of him screamed not to. Instead, he reached over, gripping the handle of the small kitchen knife he kept near the sink. His breathing was ragged, uneven. And then, the footsteps stopped, right outside the RV's door. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Mark gripped the knife tighter. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. And then, knock. Knock. Mark's lungs seized. The knock wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was calm. Controlled. Like whoever, or whatever, was outside knew he was awake. The air inside the RV felt thick. Heavy. Mark didn't move, didn't breathe. Then came a second knock. 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 A sickening, taunting rhythm. Mark's fingers trembled around the knife handle. No. This isn't happening. This is just exhaustion messing with your head. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something was outside, and it wanted him to open the door. Mark didn't move, didn't speak. He counted the seconds in his head. 1, 2, 3. The knock didn't come again. But then the radio turned on. A burst of static filled the RV, crackling through the silence like a sudden explosion. Mark nearly jumped out of his skin, his pulse roaring in his ears. The station wasn't playing music. It wasn't playing anything. Just white noise. Then, buried beneath the static, a voice. Distorted. Warped. Barely above a whisper. You're not alone. Mark's breath hitched. Then, don't open the door. A chill ripped through his entire body. The voice was wrong. It sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping and disjointed. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the radio cut off. Mark sat there, knife in hand, heart slamming against his ribs. The footsteps hadn't returned, but he knew something was still out there, waiting, watching. For what felt like hours, Mark didn't move. He just listened. The desert was still. The air inside the RV felt thick and suffocating. And then, tap, tap. Mark's blood ran cold. The sound came from the window near the driver's seat. Slowly, with shaking hands, he reached for the curtain. He didn't want to look, but something compelled him. He pulled the curtain back just an inch, and his stomach dropped. There, in the dim glow of the flickering streetlight, a shadow stood just beyond the window. Not a person, not an animal, something else. Its form was wrong. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they were eyes at all, gleamed in the darkness. Mark's body locked up. Every nerve screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The figure didn't knock, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring. The footsteps returned, and they are not alone. Then, more footsteps. Not just one set this time. Dozens. They came from every direction, surrounding the RV, circling. Closing in. Mark slammed the curtain shut, backing away from the window. His breath came in shallow gasps. The sound of footsteps multiplied, moving in perfect rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A circle, a pattern, like they were trapping him. And then, the worst part, they started whispering. Mark's knees nearly gave out. The voices were everywhere. Soft, urgent, speaking his name. Mark? A dozen voices. Then 2 dozen. Merging together. Growing louder. Mark, let us in. The whispers slid under the door, crawled through the air, pressed against his skull. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, heart slamming against his ribs. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then, the door handle started to turn. The door handle twisted. Not violently. Not in a rush. Slow. Precise. Like whatever was outside wanted him to know it could get in if it wanted. Mark's breath hitched. His knuckles were white around the knife handle, sweat dripping down his forehead. Then, the sound stopped. The handle froze mid-turn. Mark didn't move. He barely breathed. And then, the footsteps began again. Circling. Pacing. Closing in. Mark's pulse pounded in his skull. He had 2 choices. 1. Stay inside the RV, trapped like an animal in a cage. 2. Make a run for it. Neither option was safe. But he had to choose. His hand shot toward the ignition. A quick escape, floor it and don't look back. But as soon as his fingers wrapped around the keys, the radio burst to life. Not static this time. A voice. A single, whispered warning. If you run, they will chase you. Mark yanked his hand away from the keys. His stomach dropped. The footsteps stopped again. Everything went still, like the whole desert was holding its breath. Then, bang, a heavy slam against the RV's side. The walls shuddered. The entire vehicle rocked. Mark lost it. He grabbed the keys, twisted them, and the engine roared to life. Mark slammed the gas pedal. The RV's tires screeched, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel as it tore out of the lot. In the side mirror, dark figures stood at the edge of the streetlight's glow. Tall, motionless, watching. And then, they moved. Not running, not walking, gliding. Mark's stomach twisted into knots. His foot smashed the pedal harder. Faster, faster, faster. The speedometer climbed, 40, 50, 60. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and black beneath the night sky. No headlights in the distance. No towns. No landmarks. Just him. And them. He gritted his teeth, knuckles pale as he gripped the wheel. This is a highway. A major road. There has to be a gas station, a rest stop, something. But there wasn't. And the figures were keeping up. Mark flicked his eyes to the rearview mirror. Nothing. His heart skipped. Had they disappeared? But then, thump. Something slammed onto the roof. Mark swerved violently. The RV veered off course, tires skidding. Another thump. Another. Something was on top. Mark's pulse hammered. He could hear scraping, nails dragging across metal. Get off! He swerved harder. The RV lurched, nearly tipping over, but whatever was on top didn't fall. It was climbing, toward the windshield. The scraping turned into a rhythmic tapping, like long, bony fingers drumming against the roof. Tap, tap, tap. Mark's hands trembled on the wheel. His foot pressed the gas to the floor. Don't look. Keep driving. Get away. Then, a shadow slid down the windshield. Not falling, lowering itself. Mark's throat tightened. A face pressed against the glass. Except, it wasn't a face. It was featureless. A smooth, dark surface where eyes, a nose, a mouth should be. Yet, somehow, it was looking at him. Mark let out a choked gasp. The thing tilted its head. Slowly. Deliberately. Like it was studying him. Then one long, spindly finger lifted and pointed at the radio. Turn it on. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Mark's fingers shook as they hovered over the dial. Don't do it. Don't listen. But the thing inched closer to the glass. Its finger tapped the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. Demanding. Mark's chest heaved, and against every survival instinct screaming in his head, he reached for the dial. The second the radio clicked on, a voice erupted from the speakers. Panicked. Urgent. Desperate. Stop driving. Mark's breath hitched. The voice was his own. Distorted, warped, but undeniably his. Stop the RV now. Mark's foot hovered over the brake. The featureless thing pressed harder against the glass. It shook its head. No. The voice in the radio screamed. It's a loop. It's a loop. Stop now. Then static. Mark's pulse raced. His eyes snapped to the road ahead, and his stomach dropped. The street sign on the side of the highway. It was the same one from the rest stop. The one he had left 15 minutes ago. That's impossible. But it was there. The same crooked pole. The same flickering streetlight. Mark's hands clenched the wheel. No, I've been driving straight this whole time. Then he saw the worst part. The RV's tire tracks. Fresh. Deep. Looping back onto the same road. Mark's chest locked up. The highway was a trap. A loop. And he was already caught in it. The thing on the windshield smiled. Not with a mouth. Not with anything visible. But somehow Mark felt it. A sickening, knowing smile. He had one option left. He slammed the brakes. The RV screeched. The momentum threw him forward, nearly sending him crashing into the dashboard. Then, silence. The engine died. A moment of silence. Too silent. Mark sat in the driver's seat, his pulse pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The RV had come to a dead stop in the middle of the dark highway, the headlights dimming. Outside, nothing moved. No wind. No rustling. Not even the distant chirp of crickets. The world had gone completely silent. That wasn't right. He turned his head slowly, peering out the side window. The street sign was still there. The same one from before. That meant one thing, he hadn't really left. The RV's headlights flickered, then died entirely. Darkness swallowed everything. Mark exhaled sharply, trying to steady his breathing. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, desperate for some sense of normalcy. No service. Of course. His fingers hovered over the flashlight icon. But then, tap, tap, tap. Mark froze. The sound was right outside the driver's side window. He turned his head slowly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he saw them. They stood just beyond the glass. 7 figures. Tall. Motionless. Their limbs too long, their heads slightly tilted as if observing him. They had no faces, but Mark felt their eyes on him. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. They weren't moving. Are they waiting for something? His chest heaved. Then one of them lifted its arm. A long, thin hand pressed against the window. Mark flinched. Tap, tap, tap. The same sound that had haunted him all night. The figure tilted its head further, as if expecting something. Mark's stomach twisted. It wants me to do something. His gaze flickered down to the radio. It was on, but there was no sound. It's never been this quiet before. Then, a sudden burst of static crackled through the speakers. Mark jumped, and then a voice. Faint, distant. He's listening now. The faceless figures stepped closer. Mark's breathing grew uneven. He reached out slowly and turned the volume up. The static cleared, and then a voice he recognized. If you can hear this, it's already too late. Mark's stomach dropped. The voice was his own, but older, tired, broken. The figures outside didn't move. The recording continued. You can't escape by running. You've already tried. Mark's chest tightened. The highway loops. The figures are not what they seem. He glanced at them through the window. Still there. Still watching. They don't want to hurt you. They want to show you something. Mark's mouth went dry. The radio whined, distorting his own voice. Go back. Go back to the rest stop. A deep, resonating silence followed. Mark's fingers twitched against the dashboard. The rest stop. The place he had been so desperate to escape. Before he could process it, the figures began to step away. One by one, they vanished into the dark, leaving Mark alone, and with one terrible realization. I have to go back. Mark turned the ignition. The engine stuttered, but started. Headlights flickered back to life, casting long shadows over the empty road. Turn around. His hands were clammy against the wheel as he swung the RV into a U-turn. The figures were gone, but somehow he felt them watching, waiting. As the RV rumbled down the road, everything looked the same. Same cracked asphalt, same barren desert. And then the sign appeared. The same flickering streetlight, the same rest stop, but something was different. The payphone was ringing. Mark pulled the RV to a shaky stop. The phone kept ringing. Don't answer it. But something told him he had to. He stepped out of the RV, gravel crunching beneath his boots. His legs felt like lead as he made his way to the phone. Ring, ring, ring. With a shaky hand, he lifted the receiver. For a moment, silence. Then, did you listen to the recording? Mark's blood ran cold. The voice on the other end was his own. But now it was urgent. Desperate. They're trying to help you. Mark's throat tightened. Who? The line crackled. The footsteps. The ones outside. They aren't the threat. Mark's grip on the receiver tightened. Then what is? A long, unnatural pause. Then, look up. Mark's breath hitched. No, no, I'm not doing that. I won't look up. The voice on the line grew urgent. Mark, you need to look. Then the line went dead, and Mark heard it, the sound of something shifting above him. His breath came in shallow gasps. Slowly, so slowly, he tilted his head upward, and his stomach dropped. There was something on the roof of the RV. Not one of the faceless figures. Something else. Something that had been there the entire time. Long, twisted limbs hung down over the edge. A gaping maw stretched open, silent, waiting. It had been watching. Hunting. The footsteps had been trying to warn him. Mark's body locked up. And then, the thing dropped down. Mark stood frozen beneath the flickering rest stop light, the dead phone receiver still clutched in his trembling hand. His breath came shallow, his heartbeat a relentless hammering in his chest. Above him, the thing still lingered on the RV's roof, massive, unnatural, watching. Its grotesque limbs, elongated and inhuman, hung over the edge, shifting slightly as if testing its next move. It had been there the whole time. And the footsteps outside? They weren't chasing me. They were warning me. His mind raced. How had he not seen it? How long had it been lurking above him? The footsteps never left tracks. The footsteps circled him, not to hunt, to protect. A deep, guttural creak came from above as the thing moved. Mark's legs threatened to buckle. If I run, it drops down. If I stay still, it waits. The figures in the darkness, the ones that had watched him through the RV windows, had stepped back when he turned to the radio. Because they weren't his enemy. Then what the hell, I asked? His fingers hovered over the receiver hook. He hesitated, and then a whisper slithered through the phone line. Mark, don't turn around. A slow, scraping noise came from above, like nails dragging across metal. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The light above him flickered twice. Once. Twice. Then darkness. Total, suffocating darkness. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, listening. The footsteps, the ones that had haunted him for nights, began again. But this time, they weren't circling. They were running. Dozens of heavy footsteps thundered toward him from all directions. Not in pursuit. They're coming to stop it. Then, the roof of the RV dented violently. Mark's knees nearly gave out. The thing above was getting restless. The footsteps slammed against the pavement, coming faster, closer. The light above the phone buzzed weakly back to life. And for a split second, Mark saw it. The figures. The watchers. They stood in a perfect circle around the RV, their featureless heads turned upward. And they lifted their hands. They're doing something. The thing on the roof let out a sound. Not a roar. Not a growl. But something wrong. A sound that shouldn't exist. It hated them. It feared them. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run. But something told him he had to stay. The figures had been following him for days. Watching. And now they were doing something to stop it. Mark's hands shook as he reached for the RV door. Mark's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the wheel. The highway stretched ahead, endless and long. The radio still hissed, but beneath the static, he heard something else. A voice. His own. Keep going. Don't stop. The words were raspy. Tired. Mark swallowed hard. I've heard this before. The road signs blurred as he sped past them. Then up ahead. A turnoff. One that hadn't been there before. Mark's knuckles turned white on the wheel. Go back to the rest stop. The highway loops. The figures are not what they seem. The words from the first radio transmission. If I take that exit, will I be free? Or will I just end up back where I started? The rearview mirror flickered. And in it, Mark saw himself. But older. Eyes hollow. Skin pale. His reflection shook his head slowly. Don't take the exit. Mark's pulse spiked. The choice was his. The engine rumbled as he neared the turnoff. His older reflection was still in the mirror, watching. Take the exit, or stay on the looping highway. He had seconds to decide. The radio static flared, and a single word cut through the noise. Choose. Mark's foot hovered over the brake. The exit was right there. But the watchers, the warnings, the figures had stepped back when he first interacted with the radio. They tried to warn him, and his own voice had told him. The highway loops. The figures are not what they seem. Mark's grip tightened, and in the final moment, he made his choice. Mark's foot hovered over the brake. The exit loomed ahead, dark, narrow, unmapped. The watchers were gone now. No distant figures waiting in the shadows. No sound of footsteps pacing outside his RV. Just silence. And the road. His hands tightened on the wheel. Take the exit? Or stay on the looping highway? His older reflection in the rearview mirror still stared back at him. Lifeless eyes, hollow face. Then, the reflection moved. It opened its mouth. Mark's breath hitched. "Don't take the exit." The voice was his, but cracked and tired. A voice that had been stuck on this road for too long. A deep, guttural creak came from the RV frame, like something shifting its weight on the roof. "It's still up there. It never left. The thing from before. The one that watched. That waited. The same presence that had been lurking every night as the footsteps circled his RV." Mark swallowed hard. The watchers weren't his enemy. They weren't circling me to haunt me. They were keeping it trapped. His older reflection blinked once. Then, barely moving its lips, it spoke again. "Drive." Mark hit the gas. The RV barreled past the exit, tires screeching. As he passed it, everything shifted. The lights on the dashboard flickered. The air grew thick. And then, boom, a thunderous force slammed against the roof of the RV. Mark's head snapped back. The wheel jerked in his hands. For a moment, he thought the entire vehicle would flip. Then, the radio screeched. A woman's voice cut through the static. "You made the right choice." Mark's stomach dropped. The windshield cracked down the center. The air inside the RV grew unbearably heavy. Something was angry. Something had been waiting for him to make the wrong move. The roof groaned. Mark knew, if he looked up, he'd see it. The thing that had been hunting him this entire time. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on the road. The radio hissed again, and the woman's voice returned, clearer this time. "You can't stop. Not yet." The RV roared forward, headlights slicing through the dark. And then, the road ended. Mark's foot slammed the brake. The tires screeched. The RV skidded to a stop, right at the edge of a drop. His chest heaved. His heart pounded. Ahead of him, there was no cliff, no ravine, no barrier, just blackness, an endless void. Mark stared. The road he'd been on had never existed. It had been leading him here, to nowhere. The radio crackled one last time, and then a different voice came through. Not a woman's, not his own, but something else, something hungry. "Come closer." Mark's breath hitched, and above him, the roof of the RV caved inward. Suddenly, the footsteps returned. Dozens, hundreds, slamming against the pavement. Mark whipped his head around. The watchers had returned. They stood in the darkness behind him, their featureless heads all turned toward the roof. The thing above snarled. Mark could feel it twitching. The watchers stepped forward. Closer, closer. And then, Mark felt the weight lift. The thing on the roof scrambled backward. The radio screamed. The RV shook violently. The watchers raised their hands. Mark felt the air shift. A blinding flash. Then, silence. Mark gasped awake. His hands clutched the steering wheel. But, the road ahead was different. The empty void was gone. Instead, he was parked at a rest stop. The same rest stop where this all began. Mark's stomach twisted. His fingers dug into the leather of the steering wheel. The radio was off. The roof was intact. And when he turned to the rearview mirror, his reflection was normal. The watchers were gone. Was it real? Did I escape? Mark let out a shuddering breath. Then, tap, tap, tap. His blood froze. The sound came from outside. Slow, deliberate. Someone was knocking on the RV door. Mark didn't move. His fingers hovered over the ignition. And then, a voice. Familiar, weak, a mirror of his own. "You left me behind." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. And this time, the reflection wasn't him. It was someone else. Someone who had been there before. Someone who had never escaped. The knocking grew louder. Then a final whisper. "Let me in." The next story. The road was endless. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The hum of the RV's tires against the cracked asphalt was the only sound accompanying him through the dark, desolate highway. He hadn't seen another car in hours. Not a single set of headlights, no signs of civilization. Just a thin, faded stretch of road surrounded by skeletal trees and a void of darkness beyond. He exhaled, trying to ease the growing discomfort pressing against his chest. Just a late-night drive. Nothing unusual. Except something felt off. His GPS had died hours ago, the screen frozen on a blank map before flickering into oblivion. His phone had no signal. That was normal for back roads, right? But the thing that really unnerved him was the road itself. No matter how far he drove, everything looked the same. He had started counting the mile markers an hour ago. And then he started counting again, realizing that he had seen the same ones before. He shook his head. He was just tired. Road hypnosis, that's what they called it. He had been driving too long, and his mind was playing tricks on him. He needed to stop, stretch his legs, and grab something to eat. As if on cue, headlights illuminated a faded green road sign up ahead. The words barely visible in the dim glow. Rest stop, 1 mile. Relief trickled through him. He wasn't crazy. He'd find a vending machine, splash some cold water on his face, and maybe even get a few hours of sleep. The rest stop appeared on the horizon, a dull oasis of cracked pavement, flickering lights, and empty parking spaces. A small, dilapidated gas station stood in the middle, its sign missing several letters. The windows were dark, the building itself looking like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Still, it was better than nothing. Mark pulled in, killing the engine. Silence swallowed everything. No crickets, no wind. Just an overwhelming stillness that made the air feel too heavy. Stepping out of the RV, he stretched, but his movements felt sluggish, like the weight of the night was pressing down on him. The air was thick with the scent of old gasoline, and something else, something stale. His boots crunched against the pavement as he walked toward the gas station's glass door. He peered inside. Empty. The aisles were lined with dusty shelves, some products still sitting in place like frozen relics from a forgotten time. A lone cash register stood open, a thin layer of dust covering its keys. Something about the place felt wrong, like stepping into a memory that no longer belonged to the world. He jiggled the door handle. Locked. Fine. He wasn't that hungry anyway. Turning back toward the RV, he noticed something strange. His own tire tracks in the dirt lot, barely visible under the dim overhead lights. They stretched back toward the road, but instead of veering off in the direction he had come, they looped around, leading back to the same entrance. His stomach twisted. That didn't make sense. Shaking it off, he headed toward the public restrooms nearby. The fluorescent light above the entrance flickered weakly, buzzing in protest. The men's room door was slightly ajar, revealing a row of stalls and a cracked mirror reflecting his own wary expression. Mark stepped inside. The air was damp, the scent of mildew clinging to every surface. He turned on the faucet, letting icy water spill over his hands before splashing his face. It did little to shake the unease settling in his bones. Something dripped. A slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap from the farthest stall. Mark froze. It sounded like water. A leaky pipe, maybe. But then the tapping sped up, shifting into something more erratic. Knocking. He turned toward the stall. The door was slightly ajar, swinging slowly back and forth, creaking on its hinges. A single drop of water rolled from the edge, splattering against the tile. Mark's breath hitched. His fingers curled into fists. He took a slow step forward. Bang! The stall door slammed shut. A blast of cold air rushed through the restroom, extinguishing the buzzing light above. In the sudden darkness, Mark's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He stumbled back, his breath ragged as he fumbled for his phone flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, shaking slightly in his trembling grip. The stall was closed, motionless. The knocking had stopped. He swallowed hard. Just the wind. Just the wind. Mark bolted from the restroom, heart hammering, breath sharp. The moment he stepped back into the lot, a wave of dizziness hit him. The night sky above stretched endlessly, starless and void, as if the universe itself had forgotten this place. Something felt wrong. The RV sat where he left it, dark and waiting. He forced himself forward, gripping the door handle and yanking it open. Climbing inside, he locked the door, his breath coming in short gasps. He needed to leave. Now. Sliding into the driver's seat, he turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. His fingers were clammy on the wheel as he threw the RV into drive and pulled out of the lot. The rest stopped fading behind him in the rearview mirror. He exhaled, pressing his foot against the gas pedal, watching the road stretch ahead once more. Just keep driving. Just get to the next town. The road stretched ahead into nothingness. The GPS flickered to life suddenly, but instead of a mapped-out route, the screen showed a blinking dot. His location. It wasn't moving. His hands trembled as he looked up. A green road sign stood ahead. Rest stop, 1 mile. Mark's stomach dropped. His hands tightened on the wheel as dread clawed up his spine. No, that wasn't possible. He had just left. He pressed the gas harder, speeding forward, refusing to believe what he was seeing. But as he drove, the same dull glow appeared on the horizon. The same flickering lights. The same abandoned gas station. His own tire tracks lined the dirt once again. His blood turned to ice. A single thought gripped his mind, paralyzing him in his seat as the RV rolled to a stop before the same deserted lot. He had never left. The road stretched ahead of Jack and Lacey, a couple traveling cross-country in their RV. They had been on the road for weeks, documenting their journey for a small but dedicated audience on their travel blog. The goal was simple: see the country, camp under the stars, and enjoy the freedom of an open road. They weren't exactly influencers, but they had found a way to fund their trip through sponsorships and ad revenue. Jack, a former mechanic, had always dreamed of living in an RV. To him, the road was adventure, the destination didn't matter. Lacey, a freelance writer, loved the spontaneity, but enjoyed planning their stops ahead of time. She had a knack for finding hidden gems, small diners, and unique places to explore. Everything about their journey had been normal, until they arrived at the rest stop. The first time they pulled in, it was just a rest stop like any other. Deserted, quiet, unremarkable. A single long overhead light flickered near the public restrooms, casting a dull yellow glow over the cracked pavement. There was an old vending machine humming quietly against the wall, stocked with stale snacks and off-brand sodas. The payphone booth stood on the far side, its receiver missing, wires exposed. Graffiti covered the walls, faded warnings from unknown travelers. Jack parked the RV, stretching his arms. "Quick stop, and then we'll find a better place to stay for the night." Lacey agreed. She hated deserted rest stops. Something about the emptiness felt unnatural, like they were waiting for someone to appear, but no one ever did. They both got out. The air was still. Too still. Lacey walked toward the restrooms, glancing at the defaced map of the region on the wall. Someone had scribbled words on it in black marker, a warning that had faded over time. "No exit. Don't stop. Keep going." She frowned. Probably a prank. People loved to scare travelers. Jack checked the vending machine, kicking the side of it when the soda he paid for got stuck. He pulled out his phone to take a picture of the place, but his GPS had stopped working. No signal. No service. "That's weird," he muttered. "Yeah, well, this place gives me the creeps. Let's go." They got back into the RV and pulled out onto the highway. The moment the rest stop disappeared behind them, Lacey exhaled in relief. 15 minutes passed. Jack drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, eyes on the dark road ahead. There was nothing but flat terrain and patches of trees, an empty highway stretching into nothingness. Lacey checked her phone again. Still no signal. Then, the glow of a rest stop appeared in the distance. Jack frowned. "Another one already?" Lacey sat up straighter. The same flickering light. The same vending machine against the wall. The same payphone with no receiver. Her stomach dropped. "Jack, that's not another rest stop." Jack slowed the RV, heart hammering. They had just left that place. Had they somehow circled back? Impossible. He had driven straight, no exits, no turns. The GPS screen was frozen. Their location was the same as before. They stared at the rest stop. It stared back. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. "There's no way we looped back," he muttered under his breath. Lacey, sitting frozen in the passenger seat, didn't respond at first. The blood had drained from her face. She reached for her phone again, refreshing the screen, but the GPS was still frozen, stuck at the last known location. "Jack," she whispered, "we never turned. We've been driving straight." Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "All right, maybe there's another identical stop along this stretch. That happens, right? Like copy-paste chain stations." Lacey swallowed hard. "Yeah, but down to the flickering light? The graffiti? The missing payphone receiver?" She didn't have to say it. This was the same rest stop. The RV idled at the entrance, its headlights casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. The fluorescent light above the restrooms buzzed weakly, flickering just as it had before. But this time, something was different. The vending machine. The one Jack had kicked earlier. The stuck soda was gone. He blinked. "No way." Lacey's breath hitched. "Jack, we have to go." Jack hesitated for a second longer, then yanked the wheel hard, stepping on the gas. The RV's tires screeched as they tore back onto the highway. This time, Jack pressed his foot down hard. The speedometer climbed, 50, 60, 70. The trees zipped past. The headlights cut through the endless darkness. 15 minutes. 20. 30. And then the rest stop appeared again. Lacey gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "No. No, no, no." Jack slammed the brakes. The RV skidded, dust kicking up into the air. His heart was slamming against his ribs. He gripped the wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. "This isn't real," he hissed. The rest stop stood there, unchanged. The same overhead light, still flickering. The same vending machine. The same missing payphone receiver. And the same soda that shouldn't be there anymore. Jack and Lacey sat in stunned silence, the RV idling. Then, something moved near the restrooms. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He stared, barely blinking. A figure. A shadow just at the edge of the light, too dark to see clearly. Lacey saw it too. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting for them. Jack's survival instincts kicked in hard. He wasn't going to just sit here and wait to find out what that thing was. "We're leaving. Right now." Lacey didn't argue. Jack gunned the engine, tearing away from the rest stop at full speed. Jack didn't slow down. His foot stayed pressed to the accelerator. He kept one hand tight on the wheel, the other gripping Lacey's knee to ground himself. She was shaking. "This isn't possible," she kept repeating under her breath. "We're stuck. Jack, we're stuck." Jack refused to believe that. He just needed to drive faster, further. The road stretched on. Darkness swallowed them, the headlights cutting through the void. He didn't let himself blink, didn't let his focus slip. Time passed. 10 minutes. 20. 40. And then, the same damn rest stop appeared again. Lacey sobbed. "No." Jack let out a choked curse and pounded the steering wheel. He had driven for nearly an hour. There was no way. "We need help," Lacey whimpered. Jack exhaled sharply. The payphone. It hadn't crossed his mind before, but if they were somehow caught in an impossible loop, maybe the answer wasn't to keep driving away. Maybe they had to do something inside the loop. Jack pulled the RV up to the rest stop again, but this time, he didn't turn away. Lacey grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. "No. Jack, please. Don't get out." Jack's pulse pounded in his skull. But he had to do this. "We need answers. And if we keep running, we might just keep looping. What if we're supposed to do something?" Lacey shook her head violently. "Or what if we're not supposed to do anything? What if we're being lured?" A deep silence fell between them. Jack's eyes flicked toward the payphone. It stood against the far wall, bathed in dim, flickering light. For the first time, he noticed something else. A cord, where the receiver had been missing earlier. A receiver, now hanging in place. His stomach turned. It hadn't been there before. Lacey saw it too. She covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a cry. Jack exhaled shakily. "I have to check." "No, you don't." Lacey grabbed his sleeve. "Please, Jack." But Jack had already opened the door. The air outside was thick, heavy. He could feel an unnatural stillness, like stepping into a vacuum. No wind. No sound. He stepped cautiously toward the payphone, heart hammering in his chest. The receiver hung motionless. Black. Old. The numbers on the keypad were worn, as if used thousands of times. Jack reached out with a trembling hand and lifted the receiver to his ear. Static. A long, empty silence. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't have stopped." Jack's stomach dropped. The voice was distorted, hollow wrong. Then, a sound in the distance. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the RV. Jack spun around, eyes darting toward the vehicle. Something was moving around it, but he couldn't see what. Shadows shifted just out of sight. He dropped the receiver. He ran back to the RV, flinging open the door. Lacey was already screaming. "Jack, go!" Jack jumped into the driver's seat, gunning the engine. The RV lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Lacey was crying, her hands gripping the dashboard. "What did you hear?" Jack's face was pale. He didn't answer. The headlights cut through the night. He drove fast, faster than before. The shadows outside moved with them. Something was following. Lacey turned in her seat, gasping. "Jack, Jack, it's not staying behind." The rest stop wasn't staying behind. It was moving with them. Jack's hands shook on the wheel. What the hell is happening? The RV rumbled forward, but the road stretched endlessly. The rest stop still loomed ahead. No matter how far they drove, they weren't escaping. And now they weren't alone. Jack's foot slammed on the gas, the engine roaring as the RV shot forward. The speedometer climbed 60, 70, 80. Lacey clung to the dashboard, her breath shallow, her knuckles white. The rest stop had to disappear. It had to be left behind. The trees blurred past. The white lines on the highway stretched into oblivion. Jack gritted his teeth. "We just have to keep going." Lacey's voice was thin, barely above a whisper. "Jack, look." Jack didn't want to, but he did. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and there it was. The rest stopped, not in the distance, right in front of them. Jack jerked the wheel violently to the left, barely avoiding slamming into the entrance. The tires screeched. The RV fishtailed before straightening out. Lacey screamed, gripping the sides of her seat. "Jack, it's not behind us. It's moving with us." Jack's hands trembled on the wheel. He refused to accept it. "No, it's a trick. His voice caught in his throat, because in the side mirror he saw it. The rest stop was shifting, not stationary, not stuck in one place. It was following them. The realization sent ice-cold fear through his veins. They weren't looping back to it. It was appearing wherever they were. Lacey clutched his arm. "We can't outrun it." Jack's jaw clenched. "We'll see about that." Jack's gaze flicked to the dense tree line beside the highway. A risky move. The RV wasn't built for off-roading, but staying on the road wasn't working. Jack yanked the wheel. The RV lurched violently as it veered off the asphalt and into the trees. The tires rumbled over the uneven ground, branches scraping against the metal. Lacey braced herself as the RV jolted. Jack dodged trees, pushing through the darkened forest. The road disappeared behind them. For the first time, a sliver of hope flickered in his chest. "See, we're off the highway. We broke the pattern." Lacey nodded shakily, gripping the edge of the dashboard. Minutes passed. Then, a gap in the trees. Jack squinted through the windshield. His stomach plummeted. The rest stop was in front of them. Lacey sobbed. "No, no." The RV burst through the last of the trees, the tires skidding against pavement as they landed back on the highway. Jack gasped in horror. He had driven off the road, through a forest, and still ended up in the same place. The buzzing fluorescent light flickered overhead. The vending machine. The payphone. The same damn place. Jack slammed his fist against the dashboard. How? The world around them felt wrong now. The air was heavy, thick. The silence was unnatural. Lacey looked at Jack, her voice trembling. "We're trapped." Jack exhaled, his breath shaky. He couldn't let her break. He had to keep thinking. There has to be another way. Jack's mind raced. Every time they tried to run, they ended up back here. What if they weren't supposed to run? Lacey wiped at her eyes. What? Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. Think about it. What if we're reacting the way it wants us to? Running. Panicking. Lacey shook her head. That's insane. Jack set his jaw. So let's do the opposite. Before Lacey could protest, Jack threw the RV into reverse. The engine revved as they sped backward. The speedometer climbed, 30, 40, 50. The road blurred. They didn't look back. Then, the engine choked. The RV shuddered. The vehicle lurched, as if it had hit something. Jack slammed the brakes, and both he and Lacey jerked forward. Silence. Jack's breath came out in short gasps. His hands shook as he put the RV back in drive. The headlights cut through the dark. And there it was. The rest stopped. Lacey let out a broken whimper. No. Jack's hands trembled. That was supposed to work. Then, a sound. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the RV. Lacey's eyes widened in horror. Jack. Jack held his breath. The footsteps moved closer. A shadow passed just beyond the windshield. Jack's instincts screamed at him to drive, to flee, but he fought against it. The payphone started ringing. Lacey shook her head violently. Don't answer it. Please, Jack. Jack swallowed hard. The last time he picked it up, something spoke to him. But they were out of options. He opened the RV door. The air outside was thick, suffocating. Every step toward the payphone felt like wading through water. The ringing stopped. Jack hesitated. Then, a single word whispered through the night. Come inside. Jack froze. The words came from nowhere. From everywhere. Lacey was standing in the doorway of the RV, eyes wide with terror. Don't listen to it. Jack's heart hammered. But what if that's the only way out? Lacey's voice broke. Or what if it's the way in? The words lingered in the air. Come inside. Jack looked at the door to the rest stop. The inside was dark. Something waited beyond that threshold. The RV suddenly rocked violently. Something was pounding on the walls. Jack and Lacey screamed as the RV tilted, as if something huge was trying to flip it over. Jack made a decision. Screw this. He grabbed Lacey's hand and gunned the engine one last time. The RV tore down the road. Jack didn't care anymore. He was driving blind, pushing the gas pedal to the floor. The world outside became a blur. Lacey held onto him, tears streaming down her face. Jack shouted, as much to himself as to the unseen force. "We are not staying here." The windshield fractured, not physically, but as if reality itself was breaking. The road twisted. The stars above warped. Jack refused to let up. Then, everything flashed white. A deafening silence. And then, Jack's hands were still gripping the wheel. His breath was ragged. The RV was parked on the side of the highway. Lacey gasped. "Where?" Jack turned his head. The rest stop was gone. The road stretched out ahead. No sign of looping. No flickering lights. Jack's entire body shook. Lacey buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "We're out." Jack didn't answer right away. He looked out into the night. Something felt off. Lacey's phone buzzed. She had service again. Jack exhaled. "We made it." But deep down, he wasn't sure. Because in the rearview mirror, just before pulling back onto the road, he thought he saw something. A flickering light, and a payphone ringing. The RV sat still on the side of the highway, dark and silent. Jack's fingers clenched the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Beside him, Lacey was curled in the passenger seat, her phone gripped in her shaking hands. The screen was on. Service was back. She inhaled shakily. "Jack, check yours." Jack hesitated. His phone had been nothing but a useless block of glass for hours. He fumbled for it, his hands unsteady, and pressed the power button. The screen lit up. A full battery. A signal. A missed call. Jack's breath hitched. The number was unknown. His pulse pounded in his ears as he tapped the notification. A voicemail. Lacey whispered, "Who called?" Jack didn't answer. His thumb hovered over the play button. His instincts screamed at him to delete it, to throw the phone away, but he pressed play. A crackling silence filled the RV. Then a voice, distorted, barely human. "You never left." A cold shiver ran down Jack's spine. The message ended. Lacey let out a shaky exhale. What the hell does that mean? Jack didn't know, but the fear in his chest twisted tighter. He looked out the windshield. The road was empty. The night stretched on, cold and endless. But he could still feel it. The rest stop wasn't done with them. Jack pulled out the RV's built-in GPS system, fingers trembling. It took a second to boot up, but when it did, his stomach lurched. The screen showed their current location. Rest stop 126, Highway 9. Jack froze. "That's not possible," Lacey whispered, reading over his shoulder. Jack's pulse hammered. The rest stop was still their registered location, but they were sitting on an empty road. No flickering lights. No vending machines. No payphone. Jack swallowed hard. "We need another way to prove we left." Lacey's fingers flew over her phone, checking maps, messages, anything. Then, "I have a signal. I'll call my dad." Jack watched as she put the phone to her ear. He could hear the rings. A real, normal dial tone. Lacey let out a breath of relief. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad, it's me." Jack strained to hear the voice on the other end. Lacey started explaining, frantically, desperately, about being trapped, about the endless loops, about their escape. Then her face went pale. Jack grabbed her wrist. "What?" She pulled the phone away from her ear, eyes wide with horror. The call was still connected, but the voice on the other end wasn't her father. It was the same voice from the voicemail. "You never left." Lacey screamed and threw the phone across the RV. The call ended abruptly. Jack lunged for his own phone, but it was already ringing. Unknown number. Jack gritted his teeth and answered. "What do you want from us?" The line hissed with static. Then, in a voice that sounded almost like his own, "Come back." The line went dead. Jack snatched Lacey's phone, his hands trembling as he searched for any mention of Rest Stop 126 online. Nothing. No business listings. No Google reviews. No satellite images. Like it never existed. Jack slammed his fist against the dashboard. "This isn't real. It's like we were never there." Lacey's breath hitched. "Or like we never left." Jack stared at her. A sick feeling crept into his stomach. He turned his attention back to the maps, zooming in on their supposed location. And that's when he saw it. A small red dot, blinking on the map. Not labeled. No roads leading to it. Jack's heart pounded. "There's something here." Lacey leaned in. "But no markers?" Jack clicked the dot. The screen flickered, then glitched. The GPS restarted itself. And when it booted back up, location, Rest Stop 126, Highway 9. Jack's breath came fast and shallow. No. Lacey covered her mouth. "We never left." Desperate, Jack pulled up local news archives, scrolling frantically. Finally, he found something. A missing persons article from 1978. Jack clicked it, his heart pounding. Local authorities continue to investigate the disappearance of 3 travelers last seen at a now-defunct rest stop along Highway 9. Witnesses report strange occurrences in the area, including travelers experiencing lost time and repeated encounters with the same location. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He kept reading. State records confirm that the rest stop was permanently closed in 1972 following a string of unsolved vanishings. However, multiple reports claim that it can still be found by unlucky travelers, appearing as if it were never shut down. Jack's hands went numb. Authorities urge anyone who encounters this location to leave immediately and never return. Jack swallowed thickly. This place isn't supposed to exist. Lacey's voice was small. But it does. Jack shook his head. We need to find someone who knows more. Jack dug deeper, scanning the articles until he found something strange. A comment on an old forum post. I made it out, but I don't think I really did. The username was J_Collins78. Jack's stomach turned cold. That was one of the missing people from the 1978 article. He clicked the profile. It had only one post, dated 10 years ago. If you're reading this, it's too late. It doesn't let go. You might think you're free, but it follows. The only thing you can do is never stop moving. Keep driving. If you stop, it finds you again. Jack jerked his head up. His breath hitched. Lacey whispered, Jack, what if? The RV lights flickered. A low humming sound filled the air. Jack and Lacey froze. Slowly, they turned toward the windshield. The rest stop was back. The payphone was ringing. Lacey gasped. Jack clenched his fists, his entire body shaking. The ringing didn't stop. Jack swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. We have to keep moving. Lacey nodded, tears streaking her face. Jack gripped the wheel, his heart pounding. And as they sped down the empty highway, leaving the flickering lights behind, one final thought burned in Jack's mind. They had been seeking answers. But maybe they didn't want to know the truth. The RV's headlights cut through the darkness, the endless highway stretching before them. Jack gripped the wheel, white-knuckled, his mind racing. Lacey sat stiffly beside him, her phone still clenched in her shaking hands. She hadn't spoken in minutes. They had been driving for hours. The rest stop was gone now. They had sped away, faster than ever before, their fear outweighing their exhaustion. They had seen the GPS glitch. They had heard the voice. But they had escaped. Hadn't they? Jack swallowed hard, stealing a glance at the fuel gauge. A quarter tank left. We need to find a real town, he muttered. Lacey nodded numbly. Yeah, somewhere, anywhere. Jack pushed his foot down harder on the gas. The engine rumbled in response. Outside, the night was too quiet. No cars, no streetlights, just the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of highway. Something about it felt wrong. Jack's grip tightened on the wheel. Lacey, check your phone again. She fumbled with it, unlocking the screen. Her hands trembled as she pulled up the map. Her face suddenly paled. What? Jack asked. Lacey turned the phone toward him. Current location, rest stop 126, Highway 9. Jack's stomach dropped. No, his voice cracked. That's not possible. That's not possible. He slammed his fist on the wheel, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lacey grabbed his arm. Jack, look at the road. Jack snapped his gaze forward, and his blood ran cold. Up ahead, flickering neon lights pierced the darkness. A vending machine, a payphone, a gas pump, the same damn rest stop. Jack's hands went numb on the wheel. They had never left. Jack slammed the brakes, his heart hammering. The RV skidded to a stop just before the rest stop's entrance. Lacey was shaking violently beside him. No, we drove straight. We never turned around. How? Jack's breath came fast and shallow. He threw the RV in reverse. The engine sputtered. The gas gauge flickered. Jack's pulse pounded in his ears. Then, the RV shut off. Total silence. Lacey whimpered. Jack, please tell me this is a dream. Jack couldn't speak. His fingers hovered over the ignition as he twisted the key again and again. Nothing. No sound. No rumble of the engine. No sound. No rumble of the engine. Just the hum of the fluorescent rest stop lights buzzing outside. Jack's breath shuddered. It won't start. Lacey let out a strangled sob. Jack slammed his palm against the dashboard. Damn it. Then, a sound. A single sharp ring. Jack and Lacey froze. The payphone was ringing. Jack's chest rose and fell rapidly. His entire body screamed not to move, but something deep inside him, some twisted, unnatural force, drew him forward. Lacey grabbed his arm. "Jack, don't." Jack barely heard her. His feet moved on their own, his breath shallow and ragged. Outside the RV, the air was heavy, thick with something unnatural. The payphone rang again, and again, and again. Jack reached out with a shaking hand and picked it up. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he brought it to his ear. Silence. His throat went dry. Then, a whisper. "Jack, we told you, you never left." Jack stumbled back, nearly dropping the phone. Who are you?" The whisper turned into something worse. Laughter. Deep. Hollow. Inhuman. Jack slammed the phone down. The sound didn't stop. It continued, echoing all around him, growing louder and louder. Until the lights shut off. Everything went pitch black. Jack couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. Lacey screamed inside the RV. Jack turned, but the RV was gone. The road was gone. The highway was gone. He was alone in the dark. A cold whisper brushed against his ear. "You can't leave, Jack." Jack whirled around, but there was nothing. Then, a single wet footprint appeared on the pavement in front of him. Then another, and another. The sound of bare feet slapping against concrete filled the air, circling him. Jack staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. More footprints appeared, this time on the RV's windows. Lacey's scream cut through the darkness. Jack ran, sprinting for the RV, his pulse hammering in his skull. He yanked the door open, lunging inside. Lacey was crouched in the corner, sobbing, her arms wrapped around herself. Jack slammed the door shut. Locked it. Bolted it. The windows were covered in handprints, smearing down the glass, as if something had tried to crawl inside. The laughter outside grew louder. Closer. Jack backed away from the door, his hands shaking violently. Then slowly, the whispers started. "Let us in." Jack couldn't breathe. The voices pressed against the RV, crawling inside his mind. Lacey squeezed her eyes shut. "Jack, make them stop." Jack's mind raced. They were trapped. This thing, this place, would never let them go. His eyes darted to the gas canister in the corner. Then to the stove. A horrifying thought formed in his head. Lacey saw the look in his eyes. "Jack, no." Jack swallowed. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's the only way." Lacey's eyes filled with tears. "What if it doesn't work?" Jack clenched his fists. "Then we're already dead." The whispers grew more frantic. "Let us in, Jack." Jack grabbed the gas canister and poured it onto the floor. The smell burned his nostrils. Lacey sobbed. "Jack, please." Jack pulled out his lighter. Outside, the laughter turned to screams. Jack's thumb hovered over the spark wheel. Then he flicked it. A small, flickering flame danced in his palm. Jack's chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, with one last breath, he dropped the lighter. Jack's breath hitched as the small flame from the lighter danced in the gasoline fumes. Then whoosh! The fire erupted, spreading like a living creature, racing along the floor, licking up the walls of the RV. Lacey screamed. "Jack!" He grabbed her, yanking her toward the door. "Go! Now!" The windows shattered as dark handprints smeared across the glass. The whispers turned into screams. "No! You belong here!" Jack shoved Lacey out of the RV first, the heat blistering his skin. He leaped after her. Boom! A massive explosion ripped through the night, sending them tumbling onto the pavement. The RV erupted in flames, a towering inferno against the dark sky. The heat scorched their faces, and Jack shielded Lacey as burning debris rained down. The voices screamed from inside the fire, inhuman, furious. "You cannot leave." Then, something shifted. The world around them shuddered, as if reality itself was cracking apart. Jack gasped, clutching Lacey as a violent wind whipped around them. The neon lights of the rest stop flickered violently. Then, everything went black. Jack woke to the sound of chirping birds. His eyes fluttered open, his head pounding. He was lying on cool asphalt, the scent of morning dew in the air. His gaze flicked around. A road. A real road. Not the rest stop. Sunlight poured through the treetops. Jack's heart leaped. "Lacey!" She stirred beside him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jack helped her sit up. "Lacey, we did it. We're out." Her breath hitched. Jack turned, and his stomach dropped. The RV was gone. Not burned. Not a pile of ashes. Just gone, like it had never existed. Jack's mind reeled. He turned in a slow circle. No vending machine. No payphone. No flickering lights. Just a two-lane highway stretching into the distance. His throat tightened. Was it over? Did they actually break free? He forced himself to believe it. Jack grabbed Lacey's hand. We need to flag someone down. Let's get the hell out of here. She nodded numbly. Yeah, okay. They stood, stumbling toward the road. And that's when they heard it. A low, distant hum. Jack froze. Lacey's fingers tightened around his. No. Jack turned his head slowly, his pulse hammering. Down the highway, in the far, far distance. A neon glow flickered. A sign. Jack's stomach twisted painfully. His blood ran cold. Lacey let out a strangled sob. No. The sign's letters glowed faintly in the early morning haze. Rest stop 126, Highway 9. Jack staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Lacey clutched his arm, her body trembling. Then, a sudden sharp ringing. Jack's head snapped toward the side of the road. His chest tightened. A payphone. Sitting all alone in the dirt, its metal frame rusted and ancient, its receiver hanging slightly off the hook. The phone rang again. Jack's knees nearly buckled. His voice came out in a shaky whisper. No. The phone kept ringing. Lacey backed away, shaking her head violently. This isn't happening. Then, Jack's pocket vibrated. His entire body seized. Slowly, with a hand that barely obeyed him, he pulled out his phone. One new notification. Current location, rest stop 126, Highway 9. Jack stopped breathing. Then, the payphone stopped ringing. The wind died. Silence. And then, a whisper. A deep, hollow whisper. Welcome back. Jack's vision blurred. His pulse pounded in his skull. Lacey let out a choking sob. Jack grabbed her hand, his voice breaking. We never left. And in the distance, the neon lights flickered.